Hello, amazing students. So I'm going to be taking just a couple moments here because I want to review some of the questions that I had given you in the close reading guide for part 3. So we're going to start with the questions from pages 114 to 132. And if you'll look here on this paper, I'm not going to give you answers to all of the questions, but I am going to highlight and go through and kind of go back to the book and show you some answers to some of the questions here that are probably important highlights for you to know. So let's start with this first section on pages 114 to 132. And I'm going to start just with this first question. Now, in the context of our reading, Coates talks about this quite a few times in our reading for this section. And one of the things that he says is that his eyes, more than any of his other body parts, suffered more. Now, we already know, because we're almost through the whole book, that Coates continually uses this motif of body. So he's constantly mentioning bodies or black bodies and how they are used and viewed, how they've been mistreated. And then he gets to this part in the book where he says nothing has been more mistreated, if you will, than his eyes. So I'm going to start just on page 116 because I just want to read the quote to you and then we'll talk a little bit about it. He says, "But oh, my eyes, when I was a boy, no portion of my body suffered more than my eyes." And then he goes on page 126 through page 127, and he says, "And watching him walk away, I felt that I had missed part of the experience because of my eyes, because my eyes were made in Baltimore, because my eyes were blindfolded by fear." Now, when he's talking about his eyes, it's kind of a metaphor because he's talking more about his vision than anything else. And so, one of the things that he talks about is that growing up in Baltimore, his view of the world was very narrow. So, all he's seen around him were the streets, were the violence, were things that he was dealing with. He talked extensively about how he never even thought about traveling. He mentioned before that he never thought, even after going to Howard University, he'd ever live anywhere else because all he knew was Baltimore. And so his eyes had kind of shrouded his vision of the world. And so when he talks about his eyes being the body part that suffered, he says because he didn't get to see things greater than where he was, he struggled with it. So in the context of what we were reading, when he talks about being in Paris, he says that, in Paris, he felt like he missed out on having this genuine opportunity of a friendship with someone because he was seeing the situation through the eyes of Baltimore instead of seeing the situation through the eyes of France or through being in a different country. And so the eye part is what kind of has hampered his ability to see beyond where he is currently. So that's an important bit that you just wanted to know for that answer. Now, number 4, Paris reminds Coates of New York. So he talks about on page 123 about how his first time being in Paris, he actually felt like it felt a bit like New York, but he said one thing was missing. So on page 123, here's what he says. "It recalled New York," and he's talking about Paris, "but without the low grade, ever present fear." And so he felt like being in Paris for the first time, he did not feel fear like he felt continually being in Baltimore, like he felt continually being in New York. So he felt like the experience of him traveling gave him what it felt like to live a life without fear, at least even just for a moment. Okay, number 7. What did the Coates family see in Paris that reminded them of the insistent injustice still happening in America? So, if you remember on this part of the book, he is talking about how much he's enjoying France, and then he goes to get off of a train, and he realizes that there is a person there who is protesting the death and the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's killer. And so he is then in that moment kind of shaken back to the reality of race and the reality of race in America when he sees this young man protesting what happened to Trayvon Martin. Okay, question number 9. I'm actually not going to go too into depth for question number 9 because you will see this question again, but I do want to give you some ways to think about it. So question number 9 says, explain what Coates means when he says Black life is cheap, but in America, Black bodies are a natural resource of incomparable value. So first, I want you to think about the first part, which is Black life is cheap. And I want you to consider all of the examples he gives us, not only of police brutality, that ended with people being severely hurt, but police brutality in which people ended in death. I want you to think about the instance where he interviewed the mom, where her son was killed for listening to music too loud in his car. I want you to think about the value he places, even when he talks about Prince Jones, the value he places on how valuable Black life is in America. And so consider all of those examples that he gave. And then the second part of it is that he says Black bodies are a natural resource of incomparable value. So for this part of it, you have to think back to what Coates mentioned about what slavery was worth in the United States, how slavery had built the foundation of our country's economic system, about how the dream, the American dream, has been built on the backs of slavery, like that there would be no freedom, no American dream without there being violence and slavery. And so in order to answer that question, you have to think in terms of, okay, what is he saying about Black life, the value of Black life, meaning when a person of color, in particular an African American, is killed in our country, how valuable is their life? And he kind of juxtaposes that to this question of, but their bodies, as when it comes to building the economy, has tons of value. So I just want you to think about it. I'm not going to give you the answer for it because you do see this question on your learning check, but those are just some ways and things for you to think about as you're going there. Okay, so for part 3, I have 3 other questions that we're going to talk about really quickly, and we'll get through these fairly quickly, and then you can be on your way. So question number 3. Remember in this section, Coates goes to visit Mabel Jones, who was Prince Jones's mother, and he interviews her. And question number 3 is where I'm going to pick up. So he says, why did Prince Jones choose to attend Howard University instead of a more prestigious college? Remember when he was talking to Mabel, Mabel was like, he could have went to Stanford, he could have went to Yale. Like, I wanted him to go to those more prestigious schools, but he chose to go to Howard, and she wasn't very excited about his decision to go to Howard. But on page 141, we get some insight into why he wanted to go to Howard. And I loved this quote. It's more than halfway down the page, but it says this: but like at least 1/3 of all the students who came to Howard, Prince was tired of having to represent to other people. Now, one of the things that I want you to think about, and this is important, and I've seen this to be true for people living in Silicon Valley, even for students, previous students I've had who have been at Valley Christian. One of the challenges that we face, especially if you are a person of color in a predominantly different area. So for example, I'm an African American woman and I work at a school that does not have a predominance of African American teachers and staff. And so one of the things that unfortunately happens as a byproduct of that is that you often find yourself, when you're in that situation, feeling like you have to represent not just yourself as a person, but your whole ethnicity. And so one of the things that Prince Jones, or that Coates talks about with Prince Jones, is he was tired of doing that. Like growing up in an affluent neighborhood, growing up in and going to a magnet school, growing up and always being in an area where he was predominantly not a part of the majority, he always had to answer not just for himself, but for his race. And honestly, there comes a point in time when you do get really tired of that. And I don't think that people do it intentionally, but it does happen. And so Coates tells us that Prince, in addition to 1/3 of the people at Howard University, they go to HBCUs because they're tired of answering for their whole race, and they just want to be able to be who they are without kind of carrying the weight of I have to answer for everyone else. Question number 5. Coach mentions that the dreamers have built their dreams upon the plundering of Black bodies and that they continue to build their dreams upon something. So on pages 150 to 151, he tells us what that is. So I'll read you a portion of it. It says, and this revolution has freed the dreamers to plunder not just the bodies of humans, but the body of the earth itself. The earth is not our creation. It has no respect for us, and it has no use for us. And its vengeance is not the fire in the cities, but the fire in the sky. And so he talks about in this section of the dreamers being the people who are believing and supporting kind of the American dream. Not only did they plunder Black bodies in order to build the dream, but they're continuing to plunder the very earth itself. And so he says at some point, they're going to be accountable for the fact that they continue to plunder to get what they want. So the correct answer to that is the earth. They continue to build their dreams upon not Black bodies per se anymore, but upon the very earth itself. And then number 6, what does Coates tell Samori to do for the dreamers? And this is on page 151. So he says this. I do not believe that we can stop them, Samori, because they must ultimately stop themselves. And still, I urge you to struggle. Struggle for the memory of your ancestors. Struggle for wisdom. Struggle for the warmth of the Mecca. Struggle for your grandmother and grandfather, for your name. But do not struggle for the dreamers. Hope for them. Pray for them if you are so moved. But do not pin your struggle on their conversion. So the correct answer to this is to struggle. So Coates tells his son, no matter what, and this is kind of the last bit of advice that he gives to him, no matter what you go through in life, continue to struggle. Continue to struggle and push forward and keep pressing on. All right, so from this point on, what you're going to have to do is finish reading the book. And so you should only have just a handful of pages left to read. So you're going to go on and finish reading the book. Once you're done doing that, you can navigate over to learnatbcs.net and you're going to complete this book check. So on this book check, it's all multiple choice except for the last question. You're going to want to take your time on this because I want you to try to get 100% if you can. Take your time, use your book. There's no time limit on it, so you can take as much time as you need. And then at the end, there is one extra credit question that you can earn up to 5 free points on. All right, so if you have any questions after watching this, please feel free to email me. Please let me know what it is that you need, and we will go from there. All right, guys, have a great day. Take care.